The dog stopped first. Shadow planted his paws in the snow and refused to move, his muscles locked tight beneath the silver-gray coat that had earned him his name 9 years ago in a military kennel at Fort Bragg. His ears pinned forward with an intensity that Nathan Garrett had seen only twice before in all their years together, both times in Afghanistan, both times hours before disaster struck. Nathan stood beside his truck with breath fogging in the frozen air and watched his dog become a statue. The German Shepherd did not pace or whine or look back for reassurance the way a nervous animal might. He simply stood there, 80 pounds of trained instinct telling him that something ahead demanded respect, demanded caution, demanded the kind of attention that had saved lives in Kandahar and Helmand province when the ground itself wanted to kill them. The building before them was not quite a house and not quite a cave, but something in between that seemed to belong to neither world completely. It sat at the mouth of a shallow opening in the hillside, its back wall fused directly into the rock face, as if the mountain had decided to grow around it decades ago and never changed its mind. Dark wooden beams formed the front and sides, weathered to nearly black by winters that Nathan could only imagine, and a narrow window caught the weak afternoon light and reflected nothing back but shadow. Nathan had walked into collapsed bunkers during his years of service. He had cleared buildings in Kandahar where the walls themselves seemed to breathe hostility, and every step forward felt like a conversation with death. He had followed Shadow through terrain that wanted to kill them both, trusting the dog's judgment more than his own eyes, more than intelligence reports, more than anything except the fundamental need to keep his men alive. But now his dog refused to move forward, and that refusal carried more weight than any briefing Nathan had ever received. He reached down and rested his hand on Shadow's broad head, feeling the tension that ran through the dog's entire body like electricity waiting to discharge. The familiar gesture usually brought comfort to both of them, but today, Shadow barely acknowledged the touch his amber eyes fixed on the structure ahead with an intensity that bordered on accusation. Nathan looked at the house again, trying to see what his dog was seeing, trying to understand what invisible threat had transformed his companion from a confident working animal into this rigid sentinel. The construction seemed solid enough, the kind of practical building that pioneers might have erected when they first pushed into these mountains, but there was something else about it that nagged at his attention. The snow. Nathan narrowed his eyes and studied the junction where wood met stone. In this weather, snow should be everywhere, drifting against every surface, filling every corner, burying every seam between building and earth. But the area where the house fused with the rock face remained strangely clear, as if some invisible force was pushing the accumulation away, or some hidden warmth was melting it before it could settle. Stone did not do that. Not naturally. Not in the middle of winter when temperatures had not risen above freezing for weeks. He walked forward slowly, and Shadow fell into step beside him. After a moment of hesitation, the dog's head staying low as his nose worked the air constantly. Whatever Shadow had sensed from the truck remained present, Nathan could tell from the way the dog moved, but the assessment had shifted from immediate danger to something more complex, something that required investigation rather than retreat. They approached the front door together, their boots and paws crunching through frozen crust that gave way to softer snow beneath. Nathan's right knee protested immediately, the old injury from a training accident flaring in the cold the way it always did when weather was coming. And he had learned to trust that knee more than any forecast, because it had never once lied to him about what the sky intended. The door was solid and dark-scarred by what looked like decades of harsh winters fighting to get through wood that refused to surrender. Iron hinges showed rust at the edges, and a handle made from what appeared to be elk antler jutted out at waist height with a smoothness that spoke of countless hands gripping it over countless years. Nathan studied the construction for a long moment, noting the way the frame had been reinforced at stress points, the way the threshold had been raised slightly to prevent snow from drifting underneath. Whoever built this door had expected it to hold against things worse than weather. Shadow sat down at Nathan's left side, taking the position he always assumed when Nathan needed to use his hands for something important, guarding. Watching, ready to move in whatever direction became necessary. Nathan pulled the handle and felt the door resist for a moment, swollen tight in its frame from moisture and cold, before it opened with a long, low creak that seemed to come from the entire building rather than just the hinges. Cold air rushed out to meet him, but not as cold as he expected, not as bitter as the wind that had been cutting through his flannel jacket for the past hour. Inside the house waited in shadow that felt less like absence of light and more like presence of something else entirely. Nathan stepped across the threshold and immediately felt the space change around him in ways he could not quite name. The ceiling was low but solid, supported by thick beams that had been hand-hewn from timber far larger than anything growing on this hill now, and the floor was wooden planks worn smooth by years of use until they gleamed faintly, even in the dim light. The walls on three sides were made of the same dark wood as the exterior, fitted together with a precision that spoke of craftsmanship rather than mere construction. But the back wall was stone, raw, untouched natural stone that rose up through the interior of the house and disappeared into the ceiling as if the structure had been built around the mountain rather than against it. The rock face was not flat or smooth, but textured with the organic irregularity of something shaped by water and time and forces that predated human memory. Nathan moved toward it without thinking, drawn by something he could not name but felt in his chest, like the pull of gravity. Shadow followed but kept his distance from the stone, positioning himself near the center of the room with his body angled toward the back wall. His eyes never left the rock face, and Nathan realized that whatever had made his dog stop outside was connected to this wall, to this fusion of human construction and natural formation. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the stone. Warmth flowed into his skin immediately, not the kind of warmth that came from fire or electricity, but something deeper and more fundamental, like the heat that rises from earth that has been baking in summer sun. The stone was warmer than the air around it by at least 20 degrees, maybe more. And Nathan understood suddenly why the snow did not accumulate at the junction outside. The mountain was breathing. He pulled his hand back and looked at his palm as if expecting to see some mark or residue there, some evidence of the strangeness he had just felt. His skin tingled faintly, though he could not say if that was temperature or nerves or something else entirely. This house had been built by someone who understood things that Nathan did not, someone who had learned secrets about this hill that went beyond construction and into something closer to communion. He began to explore the space with the methodical attention that his years in the army had made habitual. The main room was larger than it had appeared from outside, extending back into the cave mouth farther than he had expected, and every square foot served a purpose that became clearer the longer he looked. A stone fireplace sat off-center against one wall, its chimney angled strangely upward rather than going straight through the roof. Nathan studied the angle for a moment before understanding struck him like a physical blow. The chimney followed the rock face, using natural fissures in the stone to vent smoke while drawing heat from the thermal mass of the mountain itself. Whoever had built this fireplace had understood something fundamental about how heat moved through stone, how warmth could be harvested from the earth rather than fought for against the cold. Near the hearth, a narrow bench had been built into the wall with storage underneath, and above it, rough shelves held supplies that spoke of preparation rather than panic. Canned goods with dates written in neat handwriting, candles wrapped in wax paper to protect them from moisture, matches in waterproof containers that looked military in origin, medical supplies in a metal box that Nathan opened to find bandages, antiseptic painkillers, and a suture kit still sealed in sterile packaging. The kind of supplies you kept when help was hours away and might not come at all. He moved deeper into the space toward where the house met the cave proper and found the floor changing from wood to stone beneath his boots. The transition was deliberate, marked by a slight lip where the builders had chosen to stop fighting the mountain and start working with it. Beyond this point, the cave extended perhaps 20 feet into the hillside, lined with larger storage containers and featuring a small spring that trickled from a crack in the rock. Fresh water, inside the shelter, year-round. Nathan shook his head slowly with a reluctant smile, pulling at the corners of his mouth. His grandmother had not been hiding up here in the decades since her husband died. She had been engineering a survival system that put most military installations to shame. Shadow remained in the wooden section of the house, watching Nathan's progress, but refusing to follow onto the stone floor. The dog's reluctance puzzled Nathan until he remembered the way Shadow had reacted outside, the way his companion seemed to sense something about this place that human senses could not access. He returned to the main room and began a more systematic search, looking now not just for supplies, but for clues about the woman who had created this refuge. The house was small, but efficient, every element serving a purpose that became clearer the more he understood about the overall design. A narrow bed frame against one wall still held a mattress covered with wool blankets that smelled of cedar. A cast iron stove could serve for both heating and cooking. A table with 2 chairs sat near the window, one of them showing significantly more wear than the other. She had been expecting someone, or hoping. Nathan sat down in the less worn chair and felt something shift beneath his weight, a subtle movement that should not have been possible in a solid wooden seat. He stood immediately and examined the construction, finding a thin cushion that covered what appeared to be solid wood, until he lifted it and discovered a panel that moved. A hiding spot built into the chair itself. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the panel free, the wood swollen with age and moisture, fighting his efforts until it came loose with a soft crack that seemed loud in the silent house. Inside lay a leather-bound notebook, thick with pages, its cover cracked and dark from years of handling. Nathan lifted it carefully and felt the weight of it, the density of pages filled with handwriting that he recognized from birthday cards and Christmas letters he had received as a child. He opened to the first page and found his grandmother's script neat and precise and unwavering even after all these years. The first entries were not personal. They were technical. Measurements of the hill's angle at various points. Notes about wind direction and intensity during different seasons. Sketches of the rock formation with annotations about where water collected and where it drained. Calculations about load-bearing capacity and thermal mass that would have impressed the engineers Nathan had worked with in the Army. Margaret Garrett had been studying this mountain the way a general studies enemy terrain before committing troops to battle. He turned page after page, watching the dates progress through years and decades. The entries grew longer and more detailed as time passed, documenting observations about snowfall patterns, about which slopes failed first, when weight accumulated about how the wind carved invisible highways through the valley that could bury a man in minutes or spare him entirely, depending on where he stood. Then he reached a page that made him stop breathing. The handwriting was the same, but the words carried weight that pressed against his chest like a physical force. I did not believe the snow would take them. Nathan read the line twice before he could continue. The forecast was wrong. Or maybe we wanted it to be wrong because the animals needed tending, and Harold and Peter had walked that ground 100 times before without incident. They left at dawn to check the far pasture, and by the time we realized the storm was coming faster than anyone predicted, the road was already gone, and there was nothing anyone could do except wait and pray. 3 days later, when the snow finally released its grip on the valley, we found them together on the slope above the creek. The cold had taken everything that mattered, but they had died within reach of each other, and I choose to believe that gave them some comfort at the end. I buried my husband and my brother in the same week. I buried the life I thought I would have, and the woman I had been before that storm showed me what this mountain was capable of. I buried everything except my mind, and I intend to use what remains. If I had known what this mountain could do, I would have stopped them from going out that morning. If I had understood how the snow moved and where it gathered and which paths were safe and which were traps waiting to spring, maybe I could have said the words that kept them home. I cannot change what happened, but I can learn. I can study. I can understand. And maybe someday someone else will come to this hill without knowing what it is capable of. Maybe they will face a storm like the one that took Harold and Peter from me. And maybe if I do this right, they will survive where my men did not. This house is my answer to the mountain, not revenge, understanding. Nathan closed the notebook and pressed it against his chest, his breath coming shallow and quick as the words sank into places he had thought were sealed off forever. His vision blurred at the edges, and he realized he was crying for the first time since the day he left Afghanistan, since the day he walked away from the only life that had ever made sense to him. Not because of the words themselves, though they carried enough pain to break anyone who read them carefully. Because of what they meant about the woman who had written them and what they meant about him. His grandmother had lost her husband and her brother in a single night of snow and wind and cold that she could not control. She had been left alone on this hill with nothing but grief and questions that had no answers. And instead of leaving, instead of running from the place that had taken everything from her, she had stayed and learned and built something that might save others from the fate her loved ones had suffered. Nathan understood that impulse in a way that frightened him. He knew what it meant to survive when others did not, to carry the weight of decisions made in seconds that determined who lived and who was buried under rubble that came without warning. He knew the desperate need to do something, anything that might give meaning to loss that seemed senseless. In Afghanistan, he had watched men die because they trusted ground that lied about its strength. He had made choices in heartbeats that still echoed through his dreams years later, choices that saved some and condemned others in ways he would never fully understand. He had carried that weight home with him, and it had crushed everything he tried to build afterward. His marriage had collapsed under the pressure of silences he could not break. His career had ended when his body finally gave out, and the army had no more use for a broken soldier with a bum knee and nightmares that would not stop. His ability to sleep through the night had vanished somewhere between Kandahar and the empty apartment where he had been living for the past 3 years. Now he sat in his grandmother's chair, holding his grandmother's notebook, and realized that she had understood everything he had never been able to explain to anyone else. Across decades and distance across a lifetime they had never shared, because he had been too busy serving and she had been too busy surviving. She had understood. Shadow rose from his position in the center of the room and crossed to Nathan's side, pressing his full weight against Nathan's leg before resting his head on Nathan's knee. The familiar pressure grounded him, immediately pulling him back from the edge of memory that threatened to swallow him whole, anchoring him to the present moment with the simple reality of fur and warmth and unconditional loyalty. Nathan reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears, feeling the dog's muscles relax slightly under his touch. Shadow had been trained to recognize the signs of psychological distress, had been taught to intervene when the people he worked with began to slip away from the present into darker places, and the dog performed this duty now with the same dedication he brought to everything else. "Good boy," Nathan whispered. "I'm okay. I'm here." The words were as much for himself as for the dog. He opened the notebook again after a long moment and continued reading, forcing himself to move through pages that documented years of work and observation. The entries shifted from grief to purpose as time progressed, showing him a woman who had transformed loss into something productive rather than letting it destroy her. Margaret wrote about testing small structures before committing to larger ones, building and dismantling and rebuilding, until she understood how wood and stone could work together instead of fighting each other. She wrote about watching where snow collected heaviest and where wind carved paths through drifts that a person could walk if they knew where to look. She wrote about the cave and the thermal properties of the rock and the spring that never froze, even in the coldest winters. One entry in particular caught his attention and held it. The mouth of the hill faces southeast, which means it receives morning sun, but is protected from the prevailing winter wind that comes down from the northwest. The rock itself retains heat better than any building material I could bring up here. And I have measured the temperature at the back of the cave during every month for 3 years. In the coldest January, it never dropped below 40 degrees. If I build the house at the cave's mouth and use the rock as my back wall, instead of fighting it, the mountain will help me instead of killing me. This is the lesson I should have learned before I lost Harold and Peter. This is what I will teach to whoever comes after me. Harold would laugh if he could see me now. He always said I thought too much. Maybe he was right. But thinking is all I have left, and I intend to use it for something that matters. Nathan smiled despite the tears that had not quite stopped falling. He had inherited more than land from this woman. He had inherited stubbornness and determination and the belief that understanding could be built from the ruins of loss. The notebook continued for hundreds of pages, documenting years of work and observation and careful thought. He skimmed through sections about construction techniques and weather patterns, pausing when something caught his attention, building a picture of the woman who had lived here alone for so long without ever truly being lonely. She wrote about neighbors who came and went, about people she had helped during bad winters when the roads closed and isolation became dangerous. She wrote about a man named Frank Delaney who had gotten lost in a whiteout and stumbled to her door, half frozen after wandering for hours in circles. She had taken him in and warmed him and sent him home 3 days later with new boots and a hand-drawn map of the safe paths down the hill. "He did not thank me with words," she wrote. "He fixed my roof instead. I think I prefer it that way. Words are easy to forget. Roofs keep the snow out for years." Nathan turned to the last pages with entries, knowing before he looked that they would be different. The handwriting here was shakier, the letters formed with visible effort by hands that had lost the steadiness of youth. "I am tired now. My hands do not work the way they used to, and my eyes struggle with the small print that used to be so easy to read. But my mind is clear, and I know what needs to be said before I leave this hill for the last time. This house was never meant to be lived in forever. It was built to be stood in when leaving is no longer possible, when the road disappears and the storm closes in, and there is nowhere else to go. If you are reading this, it means the road is gone. It means winter has come, and you cannot escape it. It means you are exactly where you need to be, whether you know it yet or not. I do not know who will find this notebook, but I know it will not be someone who had an easy road to get here. Easy roads do not lead to this place. Everything in this house was placed with purpose. The fireplace draws heat from the stone. The walls are reinforced where the wind hits hardest. The food will last through the longest winter if rationed properly. The spring in the back never freezes. You do not need to understand why I built this. You only need to trust that I did. And if you are my grandson, the one who went to war and came back different, I want you to know something that I never found the words to tell you while I was alive. Building saved me. Not time, not prayer, not the company of others, though all of those things helped in their own way. The work itself saved me. The feeling of creating something that would stand when everything else fell. You lost people too. I know this without knowing the details. I can see it in the way you hold yourself in photographs and the words you do not write in your letters. You carry weight that no one should carry alone. This house is my gift to you. Not the building itself, though I hope it serves you well, but the knowledge that survival is possible, that purpose can be found, that even the worst loss does not have to be the end. Build something, fix something, create something that matters. And when the storm comes, stand. With all my love, Margaret. Nathan closed the notebook and sat very still in the chair with one hand resting on Shadow's head and the other pressed flat against the leather cover, as if he could absorb his grandmother's wisdom through his skin. The tears came freely now, and he did not try to stop them. He had not cried when his marriage ended in a quiet courthouse with papers that felt heavier than they should have. He had not cried when he left the army with a medical discharge and a prescription for pills he never filled. He had not cried at his grandmother's funeral because he had not been there to cry, had received the news through a chaplain who mispronounced her name twice, while Nathan sat in a tent on the other side of the world. But now alone in a house built into a mountainside by a woman who understood loss better than anyone he had ever known. Nathan Garrett let the grief flow through him without resistance. Shadow pressed closer and did not whine or try to lick the tears away. The dog simply existed beside him, solid and real and faithful the way he had been since the day Nathan pulled him from that kennel and gave him a name and a purpose. They stayed like that until the light outside the narrow window shifted from pale afternoon to deeper gray, and the fire Nathan had not yet built became necessary rather than optional. He stirred eventually and wiped his face with the back of his hand before standing slowly. His knee screamed protest at the change in position, stiff from cold, and the awkward angle of the chair, and he welcomed the pain as evidence that he was still alive and still present in this moment. "Okay," he said aloud to the empty room. "We're staying." Shadow's ears perked at the word, and the dog rose with a shake that sent his tags jingling before looking expectantly toward the door. "Not yet," Nathan said. "Let me get the fire going first. Then we'll bring the supplies in." He moved to the fireplace and examined it more closely than he had before, seeing now the genius in its construction. The chimney angled into the rock face at precisely the right angle to create draft while drawing warmth from the stone mass around it. A small stack of kindling had been placed in the firebox along with matches in a waterproof tin, and Nathan realized that Margaret had prepared for this moment, had anticipated that someone would arrive in need. He lit the kindling and watched the flames catch, adding larger pieces of wood from the stack beside the hearth, with the patience that fire demanded. Within minutes, he could feel the change beginning. The fireplace did not just heat the air in front of it, but spread warmth along the stone wall behind it, radiating outward like ripples in water until the entire back of the house began to warm. "Brilliant," Nathan murmured. "You were absolutely brilliant." He spent the next hour shuttling supplies from his truck to the house, his boots breaking trail through snow that had accumulated while he read his grandmother's words. His pack came first, along with Shadow's food and bowls. Then the cooler with perishables that would keep better in the naturally cool cave section than in the frozen truck. Then the tool bag he always carried because years of service had taught him that the right tool could mean the difference between success and disaster. Shadow helped in his own way, staying close, but not underfoot, watching the path between truck and house for any sign of danger. The dog's earlier unease had faded, somewhat replaced by the focused attention that Nathan knew meant he was working, taking his job seriously, protecting his human from threats both real and potential. By the time full dark fell, the house felt almost comfortable. The fire crackled steadily, filling the space with warm light and the smell of burning pine. Nathan had eaten a simple meal of canned soup, heated on the stove, sharing pieces of jerky with Shadow, who accepted each one with dignified appreciation. Now he sat at the table with the notebook open before him, reading by candlelight, learning everything his grandmother had wanted him to know about this place and its secrets. Shadow lay near the boundary between wood and stone, his body angled toward the back of the house, where the cave extended into darkness. His eyes were half closed in rest, but his ears remained alert, rotating toward sounds too subtle for human perception. Around midnight, something changed. Nathan noticed it first as a shift in pressure, like the feeling before a thunderstorm when the air grows heavy and still. He looked up from the notebook and listened to the silence that suddenly seemed different than it had been moments before. Wind, but coming from the wrong direction. It pushed against the side of the house rather than flowing past, and the sound was not the familiar whistle of winter storms, but a groan that suggested the air itself was under strain. Shadow's head came up immediately. The dog rose to his feet in one fluid motion, body tense, ears pinned forward toward the front door. "What is it, boy?" Shadow did not answer, because he could not, but his body language spoke clearly enough. Something had changed outside, something significant, something that demanded attention. Nathan closed the notebook and moved to join his dog at the door. He placed his hand on the wood and felt it vibrating, faintly pushed by wind that was building rather than passing through. He opened the door a crack and immediately regretted it. Snow drove horizontally through the gap, sharp and cold enough to take his breath away. The wind had risen to something close to a roar, filling the valley with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He could not see his truck, though it was parked only 50 feet away. Nathan forced the door closed and secured it against the pressure that wanted to push it open again. His heart was beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from the recognition that he was caught in something larger than himself. A phrase from his grandmother's notebook came back to him, suddenly words he had read earlier without fully understanding their significance. When the mountain speaks too loudly, close the auxiliary door. He had not yet found the auxiliary door, but he suspected it was time to look. Nathan moved to the back of the house where wood gave way to stone, and Shadow followed but maintained his distance from the rock floor. The dog watched as Nathan searched the walls, looking for the seam his grandmother had described the hidden passage that led deeper into the mountain. There, a line in the paneling that did not match the others, too straight to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Nathan ran his fingers along the edge and found a small depression hidden in the woodwork. He pressed it and felt something release with a soft click. The panel swung inward to reveal a short passage barely wide enough for a man to walk through. It led deeper into the cave beyond the area Nathan had explored earlier, into darkness that his candle could not penetrate. Cold air flowed from the passage, not the bitter cold of outside, but a different kind, the cold of underground spaces that never saw sun and never truly warmed. Shadow growled low in his throat. Nathan grabbed a flashlight from his pack and shined it into the passage. The beam revealed rough stone walls and a floor worn smooth by water that no longer flowed. And at the end, perhaps 30 feet away, another door. A door made of iron. Nathan's breath caught at the sight of it. He started forward without thinking, drawn by the mystery of what his grandmother might have hidden behind that barrier, but Shadow moved faster than he did. The dog placed himself directly in Nathan's path, 80 pounds of muscle and loyalty blocking access to the passage with absolute determination. Shadow did not bare his teeth, did not growl again, simply stood there, with those amber eyes fixed on Nathan's face, communicating something that words could not express. Shadow, move. The dog did not move. Shadow. Nothing changed, just those eyes steady and calm and utterly resolved, telling Nathan that this was not the time, and this was not the way. Nathan had learned to trust this dog with his life. In Afghanistan, Shadow had alerted him to danger that human senses could not detect, had found bombs buried in roads, had sensed enemies hidden in buildings, had located survivors trapped under rubble. Every time Shadow communicated a warning, Nathan had listened, and every time that trust had been rewarded. But the iron door called to him with a voice that was hard to ignore. "What's down there?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Shadow turned his head slightly to look toward the passage, then back at Nathan. The message was clear in every line of the dog's body. Not safe. Not now. Wait. Outside, the wind screamed against the house with renewed fury. The structure shuddered once, a tremor that passed through the floor and walls, like the mountain was shivering and the fire flickered but held its ground. Nathan looked at the passage and the iron door barely visible in the flashlight's beam. He looked at his dog standing resolute in the face of mystery and danger. He remembered his grandmother's words about trusting the animal instincts that humans had forgotten how to hear. "Okay," he said finally. "We wait." He closed the hidden panel and heard it click back into place, the seam disappearing into the woodwork until it was invisible again. The passage was still there. The iron door was still waiting, but they would keep their secrets for another day. Shadow relaxed slightly once the panel was closed, his body losing some of its tension, though not all of it. The dog turned and walked back to his position near the stone boundary, circling once before lying down with his eyes still open and watchful. Nathan returned to the table and picked up the notebook again, flipping through pages he had not yet read, searching for any mention of the iron door and what might lie beyond it. He found the entry near the middle of the book in handwriting that was still steady and clear. The old miners left more than memories in this hill. They left tunnels that wind through the rock like veins through a body. Most have collapsed or flooded over the years, but one remains accessible from the cave behind my house. I have secured it with a door that will hold against anything short of dynamite. What lies beyond is not for everyone to see, only for those who earn the right to know, only for those who understand that some secrets protect themselves. If you find the passage, do not enter until you have read everything else in this notebook. Do not enter until you understand what this house is and why it was built. And do not enter without the dog's permission. Animals know things we have forgotten how to hear. Trust yours. He will tell you when the time is right. Nathan looked at Shadow, who had laid his head on his paws with eyes finally closing. The dog's breathing had slowed to the rhythm of sleep, though Nathan knew from experience that Shadow could go from rest to full alert in less than a second if circumstances demanded. Not tonight, then. The iron door would wait. Nathan closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind howl outside, while the house held steady around him. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed orange in the darkness, but the stone wall still radiated warmth that Margaret had harvested from the mountain itself. He thought about the iron door and what might lie beyond it. He thought about his grandmother's secrets and the wisdom she had accumulated over 40 years alone on this hill. He thought about his own secrets, the faces that visited him in dreams, the decisions that seemed right in the moment but haunted him in hindsight, the weight he carried that no one could see and no one could share. Margaret had understood all of it without ever hearing him explain. She had carried her own weight for 4 decades, and instead of being crushed by it, she had built something that might help others survive what she had barely survived herself. Nathan wanted that. He needed that. The realization hit him with physical force, making his chest tight, and his eyes burn with tears that he thought had been exhausted hours ago. For years, he had been drifting without direction, surviving, but not living, getting through days without experiencing them. He had told himself he was healing, but healing implied progress. And there had been no progress. Only endurance. Only the stubborn refusal to give up entirely. Margaret had shown him another way, not forgetting the past, not moving on from loss, but building something from the ruins, creating meaning from meaninglessness, standing when everything said he should fall. Nathan did not know yet what he would build. He did not know if he had the strength or the skill or the years remaining. But for the first time since he could remember, he had something that felt like hope. Shadow made a sound in his sleep, a soft whimper that might have been a dream, or might have been acknowledgement of something humans could not perceive. Nathan reached down and rested his hand on the dog's side, feeling the warmth and the steady heartbeat, and the simple miracle of another living creature sharing this space with him. "We're going to be okay, boy," he said quietly. "I think we're going to be okay." The wind continued to howl outside with a fury that seemed personal. Snow piled against the windows until the glass was almost completely covered. The temperature dropped toward numbers that could kill an unprepared man in hours. But inside the house at the mouth of the cave, Warmth held its ground. The fire had become coals, but the stone wall radiated heat that Margaret had learned to harvest decades ago, and the design she had perfected over years of trial and error proved itself once again. Nathan finally allowed himself to sleep, still sitting in the chair with his hand resting on Shadow's side. He did not dream of Afghanistan for the first time in longer than he could remember. He did not dream at all, just darkness that felt warm and complete, like being held by something larger than himself that did not need to be named or understood. Morning came gray, and still the light filtering through snow-covered windows with a muted quality that suggested the world outside had changed while Nathan slept. He woke to find Shadow already at the door, standing at attention with ears forward and body tense in a way that demanded investigation. The dog had not made a sound, had not disturbed Nathan's rest, but something had shifted in the hours before dawn. Nathan rose from the chair and crossed to join his dog, his knee screaming protest at the movement after a night spent in an awkward position. He ignored the pain because it was familiar and because there were more important things to attend to. "What do you hear?" Shadow's tail gave a single slow wag that communicated curiosity rather than alarm. Nathan opened the door and stepped back immediately as cold air rushed in to fill the space he had warmed overnight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed beyond recognition. Snow covered everything in drifts that erased the shape of the land, turning familiar contours into alien geometry. His truck was a white mound barely recognizable as a vehicle. The trees along the hillside had become sculptures of ice and frost that sparkled faintly in the gray light, and the road was gone. Not just covered with snow that could be cleared given time and effort. Gone. Erased. Where the track had wound down the hillside toward town, there was now only unbroken white that showed no trace of the path connecting this place to civilization. Nathan stepped onto the porch and looked down the valley where smoke rose from somewhere far below, barely visible against the gray sky. The town was still there. People were still there. Life continued in the lowlands where roads could be cleared and power could be restored. But they might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did him now. He was alone on this hill with his dog and his grandmother's house, and whatever secrets waited behind the iron door, and there would be no leaving until winter decided to release its grip. For a moment, the old fear returned with familiar intensity. The tightness in his chest, and the racing heart, and the overwhelming urge to run, even though there was nowhere to run to. His hands began to tremble the way they did when the memories came too fast and too strong. Shadow pressed against his leg immediately, solid and warm and real. The dog looked up at him with amber eyes that held no judgment, only patience and loyalty and the quiet confidence that came from years of partnership. Nathan took a breath that shook slightly on the way in. Then another that was steadier. Then a third that was almost normal. "Okay," he said aloud. "We stay." He turned to go back inside to start the fire again, to eat breakfast, to begin the process of living in this place that his grandmother had built for exactly this situation. That was when Shadow's head snapped to the left with a suddenness that made Nathan freeze. The dog stiffened instantly, every muscle tensing at once. A growl built in his throat, low and sustained and serious in a way that Nathan had learned to take very seriously indeed. Shadow's eyes fixed on a point down the hill, somewhere in the white expanse that had swallowed the road. Nathan followed his gaze, but saw nothing except snow and silence, and the aftermath of a storm that had reshaped the world overnight. "What is it, boy?" The growl deepened. Shadow's hackles rose along his spine, the silver gray fur standing straight in a line from shoulders to tail, his lips pulled back slightly, not quite showing teeth, but close enough to communicate that something had triggered every protective instinct the dog possessed. Nathan looked where Shadow was looking and saw nothing moving, nothing that seemed out of place, just the white expanse of fresh snow and the dark shapes of trees half buried by drifts. But Shadow saw something, or heard something, or sensed something that Nathan's human limitations could not perceive. The dog held his position for a long moment, then suddenly relaxed. The growl stopped. The hackles settled. Shadow turned and looked at Nathan, then back at the hillside, then at Nathan again. The message was clear enough. Whatever he had sensed, it was not coming closer right now, but it was there. It was real, and it bore watching. Nathan spent a long moment studying the snow-covered landscape, searching for any sign of what had triggered his dog's reaction. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed wrong. But he had learned long ago that what you could not see was often more dangerous than what you could. "Come on," he said finally. "Inside." Shadow hesitated, torn between the urge to investigate and the training that told him to follow commands. After a moment, the training won, and the dog followed Nathan back into the house with one last look over his shoulder at whatever had caught his attention. Nathan closed the door and secured it before standing with his hand on the wood, feeling the faint vibration of wind that had not yet completely died. His grandmother's notebook had warned him without using specific words. This hill had taken her husband and brother. It had shaped her into a builder and a survivor over 40 years of isolation and preparation. It held secrets behind iron doors and warmth in stone walls. And now it held him too. He moved to the table and picked up the notebook again because there was more to learn and more to understand before he could approach that iron door or investigate whatever Shadow had sensed on the hillside. But even as he opened the pages and began to absorb his grandmother's wisdom, a single thought kept returning with insistent pressure. Shadow had sensed something out there, something other than wind and snow and the ordinary dangers of winter. And whatever it was, Nathan suspected he would meet it before this winter ended. Outside, the sun never quite appeared through clouds that held their gray ceiling over the valley without breaking. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier as the hours passed. On the radio, Nathan had brought from the truck a voice crackled through static with words that made his stomach tighten. Severe winter storm warning for all mountain communities. Blizzard conditions expected to develop within the next 24 to 48 hours. All residents advised to shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Nathan looked at Shadow, and the dog looked back at him with eyes that seemed to understand exactly what those words meant. "Well," Nathan said quietly, "good thing we're not going anywhere." He turned off the radio to save the batteries and returned to his grandmother's notebook. The answers were in there somewhere. He was certain of it now, and he had plenty of time to find them. The house creaked once as wind pressed against its walls, then settled into silence that felt like patience. The fire burned steadily in the fireplace that drew heat from stone. The spring trickled quietly in the cave at the back of the house, and somewhere on the hillside, something waited in the snow. Nathan read on, learning everything his grandmother had to teach him about survival and purpose, and the quiet courage of standing when everything said you should fall. The storm was coming, but he was exactly where he needed to be. 3 days passed before the mountain decided to speak. Nathan had used the time well reading through his grandmother's notebook until he could recite passages from memory, learning the rhythms of the house and the patterns of heat that moved through stone walls, like blood through veins. He had organized supplies, checked the integrity of every window and door, cleared snow from the porch each morning, only to watch it accumulate again by afternoon. He had fallen into a routine that felt almost peaceful, almost normal, as if living alone on a frozen hillside with only a dog for company was exactly what he had been searching for all along. Shadow had not relaxed. The German Shepherd spent his days moving between windows and doors, pausing at each one to test the air with his nose before moving on to the next. He ate when Nathan fed him and slept when exhaustion demanded it, but his rest was shallow and interrupted by sounds that Nathan could not hear. 3 times during those 3 days, the dog had stood at the front door with hackles raised and that low growl building in his throat, staring at something on the hillside that refused to reveal itself. Nathan had learned to trust his dog's instincts more than his own senses, but there was nothing he could do about a threat he could not see or identify. So he watched and waited and prepared for whatever was coming the way his grandmother had taught him, through pages of careful observation and hard-won wisdom. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind changed direction. Nathan noticed it first as a difference in the sound against the walls, a shift from the familiar whistle of northwest gust to something deeper and more sustained that came from the wrong side of the house. He set down his coffee and moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass to see what the world outside was doing. The sky had thickened overnight into something that looked less like clouds and more like a solid ceiling pressing down on the valley. Snow fell in flakes larger than any Nathan had seen since arriving, each one the size of a silver dollar, drifting down with a weight that suggested much more to come. Shadow appeared at his side without being called, the dog's body pressed against Nathan's leg and the gesture of support that had become familiar over the years. The animal's ears rotated constantly, tracking sounds that human ears could not perceive. "Bad one coming," Nathan said quietly. Shadow's tail gave a single slow wag of acknowledgement. Nathan moved to the radio and turned it on, wincing at the static that filled the small room, before a voice emerged from the noise. "This is an emergency broadcast for all residents of Cooper County. A severe winter storm system has developed faster than initial forecasts predicted. Blizzard conditions are now expected within the next 6 to 8 hours, rather than the previously reported 24 to 48 hours. All residents are advised to shelter immediately and avoid travel under any circumstances. Wind speeds are expected to exceed 60 miles per hour, with visibility reduced to near zero. This storm represents an immediate threat to life. Repeat, this storm represents an immediate threat to life." The broadcast continued with details about emergency shelters and town phone numbers that would be useless to anyone without service, and reassurances that help would come as soon as conditions permitted. Nathan listened until the message began to repeat, then turned off the radio to save the batteries he might need later. 6 to 8 hours. Less time than he had hoped, but more than enough if the house performed the way his grandmother had designed it to perform. He spent the next hour securing everything he could think to secure. Windows were checked and rechecked, their frames tested for gaps that might let wind drive snow into the interior. The auxiliary door to the deeper cave passage was examined and found solid, the iron barrier beyond it, still waiting for the day when Shadow would give permission to explore further. Food and water were inventoried, medical supplies reviewed, firewood stacked within easy reach of the hearth. Shadow watched all of this with the attentive patience of a partner who understood the importance of preparation, even if he could not participate in the physical tasks. The dog moved when Nathan moved, stopped when Nathan stopped, and maintained a constant awareness of both the interior and exterior of the house. By mid-afternoon, the wind had risen to something that sounded almost alive. It did not whistle or moan, but roared against the stone face of the hill, finding angles and gaps that turned its voice into something that resembled screaming. Snow no longer fell, but flew horizontally, driven by gusts that made the windows rattle in their frames. Nathan stood at the narrow front window and watched the world disappear. His truck vanished first, swallowed by white, until even the general shape of it was gone. Then the trees at the edge of the clearing became shadows that faded and returned and faded again as walls of snow swept across the landscape. Finally, even the near ground disappeared, and there was nothing outside the window but white chaos that seemed to have no end and no beginning. The house held. He could feel it holding feel the way the structure leaned into the mountain behind it and drew strength from stone that had stood for millennia. The wind pushed and the house pushed back the contest between nature and human engineering, playing out in creaks and groans that became a kind of conversation. Shadow had positioned himself near the door that led to the stone section of the house, his body angled to watch both the entrance and the passage to the rear cave. His ears were pinned forward, and his breathing had slowed to the deliberate rhythm that Nathan recognized from countless operations in hostile territory. The dog was working, sensing, processing information that Nathan could not access. Hours passed in the strange twilight of the storm. Nathan ate sparingly from the supplies he had organized, sharing portions with Shadow, who accepted each offering with dignified appreciation. He read more of his grandmother's notebook by candlelight when the gray through the windows grew too dim to see, by learning about winters that had tested this house before and the ways it had been modified to meet each new challenge. Around what Nathan estimated to be 7 in the evening, though time had lost its meaning in the eternal gray outside, Shadow suddenly rose to his feet. The movement was so abrupt that Nathan dropped the notebook. The dog stood rigid, every muscle locked, his head turned toward the front of the house with an intensity that sent ice down Nathan's spine despite the warmth of the fire. "What is it?" Shadow did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stood there pointing toward the door like a hunting dog indicating game, and Nathan understood that whatever was out there was not a threat, but something else, something that needed help. He grabbed his coat and moved toward the door, ignoring the part of his mind that screamed about the danger of going out in conditions that the radio had described as an immediate threat to life. Shadow fell into step beside him, and when Nathan reached for the door handle, the dog did not try to block his path. Permission granted. Nathan opened the door and felt the storm try to enter the house like a living thing. Wind and snow rushed through the gap with a force that staggered him, and he had to brace himself against the frame to keep from being knocked backward. The noise was incredible. A wall of sound that seemed to have physical weight. Through the chaos, he heard something that did not belong to the storm. A sound that cut through the wind because it was higher and more desperate than nature alone could produce. A car horn. Nathan leaned into the wind and forced himself onto the porch Shadow, pressing close against his leg as they faced the wall of white together. The horn sounded again, 3 short blasts followed by 2 long ones, the universal signal for distress that any veteran would recognize. He could not see the source. He could not see anything beyond the edge of the porch. But the sound was coming from somewhere down the hill, from the direction of the road that no longer existed under its burden of snow. Shadow lunged forward before Nathan could stop him. The dog dove into the white chaos and disappeared, instantly swallowed by snow so thick that even his dark coat vanished within 3 feet of the porch. Nathan shouted his name, the word torn from his lips and carried away by wind that did not care about human voices. For 5 seconds, that felt like 5 hours. Nathan stood alone in the doorway of his grandmother's house while his dog vanished into a storm that could kill in minutes. Then he heard barking, sharp and rhythmic and insistent, coming from somewhere ahead and to the left. Shadow's signal for "found something, come now," and Nathan obeyed without hesitation because 9 years of partnership had taught him that the dog was never wrong about things that mattered. He stepped off the porch and immediately lost all sense of direction. The wind hit him from what felt like every side at once, and the snow was so thick that he could not tell up from down. His boots sank into drifts that reached past his knees, and each step forward was a battle that cost more energy than it should. Shadow's barking guided him. The sound cut through the wind because the dog knew how to project his voice, knew how to make himself heard when communication meant survival. Nathan followed that sound the way a ship follows a lighthouse, trusting it completely, even when every other sense was overwhelmed. He walked for what felt like miles, but was probably only 100 feet. The storm did everything it could to stop him, to turn him around, to convince him that going back was the only sane choice. But the barking continued, and Nathan continued to follow. Then, suddenly, Shadow was there, appearing out of the white like a ghost made solid. The dog pressed against Nathan's legs and then turned and moved forward again, slower now, leading the way with the careful steps of an animal who knew the ground beneath the snow could not be trusted. 20 more feet and the shape of a car emerged from the chaos. It was tilted at a wrong angle, its front end buried in a drift that had formed against a rock outcropping Nathan remembered from his first day on the hill. The hazard lights were still flashing, their orange glow barely visible through the snow that caked every surface. The horn sounded again, weaker now, as if the battery was dying. Nathan fought his way to the driver's side door and wiped snow from the window with his gloved hand. A face appeared on the other side of the glass, and for a moment they simply stared at each other through the barrier. The woman was younger than Nathan, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement she had started the day with. Her face was pale and drawn with fear, but her eyes held a steadiness that Nathan recognized from soldiers who had learned to function despite terror. He pulled at the door handle and found it locked. The woman's hands fumbled with something inside. Then the lock clicked, and Nathan wrenched the door open against the wind that tried to slam it closed again. "My name is Nathan," he shouted over the storm. "I have shelter. Can you walk?" The woman nodded, then turned to look at the back seat. Nathan followed her gaze and saw 2 children huddled together under coats that were far too thin for this weather. A boy who looked about 8 years old with wide eyes that had gone glassy with cold. A girl maybe 6 years old who clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest as if it was the only thing in the world that made sense. "We have to move now," Nathan said. "The temperature is dropping and this car won't keep you alive." The woman understood. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the assessment of risks and options that every parent made when their children's lives hung in the balance. She turned back to the children and spoke in a voice that was firm despite the fear underneath. "We're going with this man. He has a warm house. I need you to be brave for just a few more minutes. Can you do that?" The boy nodded without speaking. The girl buried her face in the rabbit and made no sound at all. They moved as quickly as the storm would allow. The woman helped the children out of the car, while Nathan positioned himself to block the worst of the wind. Shadow circled the group, constantly checking their perimeter, making sure no one strayed too far from the others. The walk back to the house took twice as long as Nathan's journey out. The children could not move as fast as adults, and the boy kept stumbling in drifts that reached nearly to his waist. Nathan ended up carrying the girl, her small body pressed against his chest, while her mother guided the boy with one hand and gripped Shadow's collar with the other. The dog led them home. Nathan had lost all sense of direction within seconds of leaving the car, but Shadow knew exactly where they were and exactly where they needed to go. The German Shepherd moved through the storm with a confidence that seemed impossible, given the conditions, pausing only to make sure the humans were still following before continuing toward the invisible house that waited in the white chaos. They reached the porch without warning, the structure appearing out of the snow like something conjured by magic. Nathan pushed through the door first, then turned to help the others inside, while Shadow brought up the rear. The dog's eyes scanning the storm one final time before the door closed against it. For a long moment, no one moved. They stood in the warmth of the house while snow melted on their clothes and dripped onto the floor. The fire crackled steadily in the fireplace, and the stone wall behind it radiated heat that began immediately to penetrate frozen clothing and numb skin. The woman was the first to speak. "Rachel Thornton," she said, her voice steadier now that they were out of the wind. "These are my children, Marcus and Emma." Nathan nodded. "Nathan Garrett. This was my grandmother's house." Rachel looked around the space with eyes that were taking in details, assessing the shelter the way any mother would assess a place where her children might need to survive. Her gaze lingered on the stone back wall, on the supplies arranged with military precision on the fire that burned without wavering. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 4 days. The road disappeared the morning after I arrived." Rachel absorbed this information without visible reaction. "We were trying to get to my mother's place in the next valley. The forecast said we had time. Obviously, it lied." The boy Marcus had moved closer to the fire without being told. His hands were extended toward the warmth, and Nathan could see them trembling even from across the room. The girl Emma had not let go of her rabbit and had not looked up since entering the house. "Let me get some blankets," Nathan said. "And I have soup that I can heat up. You need to get warm from the inside as well as the outside." He moved through the house, collecting what was needed while Rachel helped her children out of wet coats that were doing more harm than good now that they were indoors. Shadow positioned himself near the door, watching the family with alert interest, but without the wariness he had shown toward the storm. The dog had made his assessment. These people were not threats. Within 30 minutes, the children were wrapped in wool blankets and holding cups of soup that steamed in the warm air. Color had begun to return to their faces, and Marcus had started to relax enough to look around the house with curiosity rather than fear. Emma still clutched her rabbit, but had begun to make eye contact with the adults when they spoke. Rachel sat at the table across from Nathan, her hands wrapped around her own cup of soup, her eyes still cataloging every detail of the space around her. "This house is different," she said finally. "I've never seen anything like it." Nathan nodded. "My grandmother built it over 40 years. She understood how to work with the mountain instead of against it. The heat from the stone wall, Rachel said. That's not normal. Thermal mass. The rock absorbs warmth during the day and releases it at night. The fireplace is designed to maximize the effect. Rachel was quiet for a moment. We would have died in that car. If you hadn't found us, if your dog hadn't led you to us, we would have been dead before morning. Nathan did not argue because she was right. The car would have become a freezer within hours, and 3 people huddled under inadequate coats would not have seen another sunrise. Shadow found you, Nathan said. I just followed him. Rachel looked at the dog who had settled near the stone boundary, his eyes half closed, but his ears still rotating to catch sounds from outside. He knew we were there. Through all that wind and snow, he knew. He's been doing that his whole life, knowing things that people can't know. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, at the mouth of the cave, warmth held, and the fire burned, and 4 people who had been strangers an hour ago began the process of becoming something else. The night passed slowly. Nathan gave up his place near the fire so the children could sleep in the warmest part of the house, wrapping themselves in blankets on the floor, while their mother sat nearby and watched them with the fierce attention of someone who had nearly lost everything. He retreated to the table by the window and continued reading his grandmother's notebook by candlelight, though his attention kept drifting to the family that had arrived so unexpectedly. Rachel did not sleep. She sat with her back against the wall and her eyes moving between her children and the door alert for any sound that might signal new danger. Around midnight, she rose quietly and moved to where Nathan sat. "Can I see that?" she asked, gesturing toward the notebook. Nathan hesitated only a moment before handing it over. Rachel sat down across from him and began to read, her eyes moving over his grandmother's neat handwriting with an intensity that surprised him. "She was an engineer," Rachel said after several minutes. "She taught herself. After her husband and brother died in a storm, she spent decades learning how to survive on this hill." Rachel turned more pages, pausing occasionally to study a diagram or reread a passage. "She built this house to save people." "That's what I think, yes." "And you came here after she died." Nathan nodded. "She left it to me in her will. I didn't know what to expect when I arrived." Rachel looked up from the notebook and met his eyes directly. "Why did she leave it to you?" The question was simple, but the answer was not. Nathan thought about how to explain the connection he had felt while reading his grandmother's words, the recognition of shared pain that had crossed decades and distance. "She knew I was broken," he said finally. "In her letter to me, she said she could see it in the way I held myself in photographs. She knew I had lost people and carried weight that no one should carry alone." Rachel absorbed this without comment, her eyes returning to the notebook. She read in silence while the fire crackled and the wind howled and her children slept peacefully for perhaps the first time in hours. Around 2 a.m, Shadow suddenly rose to his feet. The movement was silent but immediate, and both Nathan and Rachel turned to look at the dog who had positioned himself near the rear stone wall. His body was tense, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening to something deep beneath the surface of the earth. "What's wrong?" Rachel whispered. Nathan was already moving toward the dog, his grandmother's notebook forgotten on the table. He knelt beside Shadow and placed his hand on the stone floor, feeling for the vibration he had sensed during his first night in the house. It was there, stronger than before. A rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from somewhere far below, like a heartbeat that belonged to the mountain itself. Shadow began to dig, not wildly, not frantically, but with deliberate purpose. The dog's paws scraped against the stone floor at the junction where wood met rock, his nose pressed close to a crack that Nathan had not noticed before. "He's been doing this for 3 days," Nathan said quietly, "digging at specific points along the base of the wall. What is he looking for?" "I don't know. But whatever it is, he keeps coming back to the same spots." The vibration in the stone intensified for a moment, then faded. Shadow stopped digging and sat back on his haunches, his amber eyes fixed on the crack he had been investigating. Nathan leaned closer and placed his ear against the cold stone. For a moment, there was nothing but the muffled roar of wind from outside. Then he heard it, a distant sound that should not have been possible. The unmistakable rumble of earth moving against earth. He sat up quickly, his heart suddenly racing. "We need to wake the children." Rachel did not ask why. She simply rose and moved to where Marcus and Emma slept, shaking them gently awake while keeping her voice calm and steady. Nathan moved to the notebook and found the passage he needed, his grandmother's words coming back to him with urgent clarity. "When the mountain speaks too loudly, close the auxiliary door." He understood now what she had meant. The vibrations in the stone, the sounds of earth moving beneath them, these were warnings that the mountain was shifting under the weight of snow that had been accumulating for days. The storm outside was only part of the danger. The real threat was what the storm was creating, tons of snow piling onto slopes that could only hold so much weight before they gave way. Nathan moved to the hidden panel in the wall and pressed the release. The passage to the iron door appeared, cold air flowing out from the deeper cave, but he was not interested in what lay beyond the iron barrier. He was interested in the passage itself. If the slope above the house failed, if an avalanche came down the mountain with the weight and speed that such events could achieve, the front of the house would take the impact. The stone wall that formed the back would hold because it was part of the mountain itself, but everything else would be tested. His grandmother had designed the auxiliary passage as a pressure release, a way to let the force of an avalanche flow through the house rather than destroying it. But for that to work, the iron door at the end of the passage had to remain closed. Nathan stared at the door that had called to him since his first day in the house, the barrier that Shadow had refused to let him approach. Whatever secrets lay beyond it would have to wait. He closed the panel and secured it, then turned to find Rachel standing behind him with both children clutching her hands. "Avalanche," she said. It was not a question. "Maybe. My dog has been sensing something in the ground for days. The vibrations are getting stronger." Rachel's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "What do we do?" Nathan looked around the house that his grandmother had spent 40 years perfecting, the shelter she had built to stand when everything else fell. He looked at the stone wall that fused with the mountain, at the reinforced beams, at the narrow windows set deep in thick frames. "We stay," he said. "We trust the house. We trust the woman who built it." Shadow had moved to position himself between the family and the rear wall, his body angled to protect them from whatever might come through the stone. The dog's eyes were fixed on the rock face with an intensity that suggested he was seeing things hidden from human perception. They waited. The storm continued to rage outside, wind and snow battering the house with unrelenting fury. Inside, the fire burned lower, and the candles flickered, and 4 people stood in a space barely large enough to hold them, watching and listening for the sound that would tell them whether they lived or died. Marcus pressed closer to his mother, and Emma buried her face in the stuffed rabbit she had not released since leaving the car. Rachel kept her arm around both children, her eyes moving constantly between the walls around her. Nathan watched Shadow because the dog would know before any of them what was coming. The vibration returned stronger than before, and this time Nathan could feel it through the soles of his boots without needing to kneel and press his hand to the floor. The stone wall seemed to tremble, though whether that was actual movement or his imagination he could not say. Shadow growled. The sound was low and sustained and different from any warning Nathan had heard from the dog before. It was not directed at a visible threat, but at something invisible, something massive, something that was bearing down on them from somewhere above. "Get against the stone wall," Nathan ordered. "Now." They moved without hesitation, pressing their backs against the warm rock that had absorbed 40 years of heat from fires lit by a woman who understood this mountain better than anyone. Nathan positioned himself in front of Rachel and the children, though he knew that if what he feared was coming, his body would provide no protection at all. The rumble grew louder. It started as a sound felt more than heard, a deep bass vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then it became audible, a roar that built and built and built until it was louder than the wind, louder than anything Nathan had experienced outside of combat. The mountain was falling. Snow and rock and debris came down the slope above the house with a force that defied comprehension. The sound was so loud that Nathan could not hear Rachel's scream, or the children's cries, or even his own voice shouting for everyone to hold on. The world became pure noise and vibration, and the absolute certainty that death was descending on them with the weight of 1,000 tons of frozen destruction. The house shuddered. Something hit the front wall with an impact that made the entire structure lurch. Windows cracked but did not shatter. Beams groaned but did not snap. The floor tilted slightly, then leveled again as the force that had struck them continued past, following the natural channels of the landscape, rather than stopping to crush what stood in its way. Nathan grabbed Rachel's arm and felt her grab the children, all of them pressing harder against the stone wall that was the only thing not moving in a world that had become chaos. The avalanche lasted for an eternity that was probably less than 30 seconds. When it was over, the silence was so complete that Nathan thought for a moment he had gone deaf. Then he heard breathing his own, and Rachel's, and the children's, fast and harsh and alive. Shadow had not moved from his position in front of them. The dog stood like a statue, ears forward, eyes fixed on the front of the house, where something had clearly changed. Nathan stepped forward, carefully testing each footfall before committing his weight. The floor seemed solid beneath him, the structure still intact despite what it had just endured. He reached the front window and wiped condensation from the glass with a shaking hand. Where the porch had been, there was now a wall of white. Snow had piled against the front of the house to a height of at least 8 feet, completely covering the door and windows on that side. The avalanche had buried them, but it had not destroyed them. They were trapped, but they were alive. Nathan turned back to find Rachel still pressed against the stone wall with her children clutched to her sides. Tears were streaming down her face, though whether from fear or relief, he could not tell. "It's over," he said. The house held. Rachel made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. How is that possible? Nathan thought of his grandmother of 40 years of preparation and study of a woman who had lost everything and decided to build something that might save others from the same fate. Because someone understood what this mountain could do, he said. and she built something strong enough to survive it. Shadow finally relaxed from his protective stance, his body losing some of its tension, though not all of it. The dog moved to Nathan's side and pressed against his leg, seeking and offering comfort in equal measure. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but it no longer mattered. They were sealed in by snow that would take days to clear, but they had food and water and warmth and the solid shelter of stone that had been standing since before humans walked this land. They were going to survive. Nathan felt something shift in his chest as that realization settled into him, something that had been frozen for years, beginning to thaw. He thought of his grandmother's words about building as a form of healing, about creating something that could stand when everything else fell. He understood now, not just intellectually, but in his bones, in the place where grief and guilt and loss had taken up residence since Afghanistan. This house was proof that survival was possible. That meaning could be constructed from the ruins of tragedy. That even the worst storms could be weathered if you prepared properly and trusted the preparations when the time came. Marcus had stopped crying and was looking around the house with an expression that contained as much wonder as fear. "We're not dead," the boy said. "No," Nathan agreed. "We're not dead." "Is this magic?" Nathan shook his head. "Not magic. Planning. Someone spent a very long time making this house as strong as possible, and now we get to benefit from all that work." Emma finally lifted her face from the stuffed rabbit and spoke for the first time since Nathan had pulled her from the car. "The dog saved us," she said quietly. Nathan looked at Shadow, who was watching the little girl with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "Yes," he said. He did. Rachel had released her grip on the children and was moving through the house, examining the walls and windows with a more critical eye, now that the immediate danger had passed. She found the cracks in the front windows and noted them without panic. She tested the floor where it had tilted during the impact and found it stable. She checked the rear stone wall and found it unchanged, still radiating warmth, still standing firm. "We're going to need more wood for the fire," she said finally, her voice practical and calm. Nathan appreciated that calmness more than he could say. In his experience, the people who survived difficult situations were not the ones who panicked or the ones who pretended everything was fine, but the ones who assessed reality clearly and then did what needed to be done. "There's a supply in the cave section," he said. "My grandmother stacked it where the stone would keep it dry. Show me." They spent the next hour doing the work of survival. Wood was brought from the storage area and stacked near the hearth. Food was inventoried and a rationing plan was established. The children were fed again and settled near the fire with blankets and the promise that everything was going to be okay. Shadow took up a position near the front door, now completely blocked by snow, and watched the barrier as if expecting it to do something that required his attention. The dog's ears rotated occasionally, tracking sounds from outside that humans could not hear. Around 4 a.m, when the children were finally asleep and Rachel was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, Nathan heard something that made him freeze. Voices, faint and muffled by the snow that separated them from the outside world, but unmistakably human voices calling out in the darkness of the storm. Shadow's head came up immediately, and the dog began to bark. Not the warning bark he used for threats, but the alert bark that said, "Help needed, pay attention, something important is happening." "There are more people out there," Nathan said. Rachel was already on her feet. "Can we reach them?" Nathan looked at the wall of snow blocking the front door. 8 feet of packed avalanche debris stood between them and whoever was calling for help. Even if they could dig through it, opening that barrier might destabilize the snow around it and bring more down on top of them. But there was another way. He moved to the rear of the house toward the stone section where the cave extended into the mountain. His grandmother had written about escape routes and emergency exits, about understanding the terrain well enough to know which directions offered safety and which offered only more danger. The auxiliary passage with its iron door was one option, though he still did not know what lay beyond that barrier. But there was another passage his grandmother had mentioned, a narrow channel that followed a natural fissure in the rock and emerged on the hillside above the house. Nathan found the entrance hidden behind a storage shelf that he had not thought to move during his initial exploration. The opening was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it angled upward rather than down, which meant it should emerge above the avalanche debris. Shadow appeared beside him and sniffed the entrance carefully. The dog's tail wagged once, a signal that Nathan had learned to interpret as approval. "Wait here with the children," Nathan said to Rachel. "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, do not try to follow me." Rachel looked like she wanted to argue, but she also looked like she understood. "Be careful." Nathan grabbed a flashlight and his warmest jacket, then squeezed into the narrow passage with Shadow close behind. The rock walls pressed against his shoulders on both sides, and he had to turn sideways to make progress in several sections. The stone was cold and damp against his hands, but it was solid and stable and showed no signs of recent movement. The passage climbed steadily for what felt like 100 feet before angling to the left and widening slightly. Nathan could feel fresh air now, cold and sharp, and carrying the scent of snow rather than stone. He emerged through a crack in the rock face onto a ledge that overlooked the devastation below. The storm had lessened slightly enough that he could see the scale of what had happened. A massive swath of the hillside had given way, sending tons of snow and debris down the slope in a path that had passed directly over the house. The structure was buried almost to its roof on the uphill side, but the stone wall that formed the back had diverted the flow around the sides rather than through the middle. His grandmother's design had worked exactly as she intended. Below and to the left, Nathan saw movement. 3 figures huddled against a rock outcropping that had provided partial shelter from the avalanche, their shapes barely visible in the dim light of a storm that was not yet finished with them. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "This way! Follow my voice!" The figures turned toward him, and he saw recognition in their movements. They began to climb, helping each other over drifts and debris, making slow but steady progress toward the ledge where Nathan waited. Shadow barked encouragement from the passage behind him, the sound carrying across the snow-covered slope like a beacon. The first to reach Nathan was an older man with a gray beard and weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He moved with the careful economy of someone who knew how to conserve energy in difficult conditions, and his eyes held a sharpness that suggested he had survived more than one crisis in his life. "Walter Crane," the man said, by way of introduction. "I lived down the hill a piece, was trying to get home when everything went sideways." Behind him came a younger man with broad shoulders and the kind of thick beard that suggested he spent more time in the woods than in town. He carried a canvas bundle over his shoulder that looked heavy enough to contain something significant. "Ben Sawyer," he said. "Hunter. Got caught in the storm trying to check my traps." The third figure was younger, still early 20s, if Nathan had to guess, with narrow shoulders and a face that was pale with cold and fear. He wore a jacket with a utility company logo and carried a bag of tools that clinked as he moved. "Kyle Webb," the young man said, his voice shaking. "Telecommunications. I was checking lines when the avalanche hit." Nathan led them back through the passage one at a time, the narrow channel forcing them to proceed single file. Shadow went first, then Walter, then Ben, with his heavy bundle, then Kyle, who seemed barely able to squeeze his thin frame through the tightest sections. When they emerged into the house, Rachel was waiting with blankets and hot drinks that she had prepared while Nathan was gone. Her face showed relief at seeing him return safely, though she hid it quickly behind the practicality of helping the newcomers get warm. The house that had seemed small with 4 people now felt even smaller with 7, but there was room enough and warmth enough, and that was what mattered. Walter Crane accepted a cup of tea and sat near the fire, his eyes moving over the structure with an expression that Nathan could not quite read. "Margaret's house," the old man said finally. I wondered if it was still standing. Nathan felt something shift in his chest at the familiar name. "You knew my grandmother. Knew her well enough. She saved my life once 30 years back. Took me in during a storm and fed me until I could walk again. She mentioned you in her notebook." Walter nodded slowly. "That sounds like Margaret. She wrote everything down. Said that knowledge was useless if it died with the person who held it." Ben Sawyer had unwrapped his canvas bundle to reveal several pounds of venison that he must have been transporting when the storm caught him. He offered it without ceremony, adding to the food supplies that would need to last until the snow could be cleared from the entrance. Kyle Webb sat near the children, his young face showing the kind of fear that the others had learned to hide through years of experience. Emma had woken during the commotion and was watching the newcomers with wide eyes, her rabbit clutched to her chest. "Are more people coming?" she asked quietly. Nathan did not know how to answer. He looked at Shadow, who had returned to his position near the stone wall and was watching the group with alert attention. The dog's presence reassured him in ways that words could not. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but if they are, we'll find room for them too." The night continued, and the storm continued, and 7 people who had been strangers hours ago settled into the rhythm of shared survival. Food was distributed. Sleeping arrangements were made. Stories were exchanged in the low voices of people who understood that noise was a luxury they could not afford when the mountain might not be finished speaking. Walter told tales of Margaret Garrett that Nathan had never heard, of a woman who had transformed grief into purpose and solitude into service. Ben shared knowledge about the land and the weather and the ways that winter could kill the unprepared. Kyle described the telecommunications infrastructure that connected these remote communities and how fragile it became when nature decided to remind humans who was really in charge. Rachel listened to all of it while keeping one eye on her children and one ear attuned to sounds from outside that might signal new danger. She asked questions that showed she was thinking ahead, planning for contingencies, preparing for whatever came next. Nathan watched and listened and felt something changing inside him that he could not quite name. For years he had been running from connection, from responsibility, from the weight of caring about people who might be lost the way his soldiers had been lost. But here in this house that his grandmother had built, surrounded by strangers who had become his responsibility simply by surviving, he could not run anymore. And he discovered that he did not want to. Shadow moved through the crowded room, pausing to let each person touch him, offering comfort with his presence the way he had offered comfort to Nathan for 9 years. The dog seemed to understand that his role had expanded, that there were now more people who needed what he could provide. Around 6 in the morning, As the first gray light began to filter through the snow that still covered the windows, Shadow suddenly stood and moved to the rear stone wall. The dog's body went rigid. His hackles rose. A growl built in his throat that was different from any sound Nathan had heard him make before, deeper and more sustained and directed not at any visible threat, but at the stone itself. Nathan was on his feet, immediately crossing to where Shadow stood. He placed his hand on the wall and felt what the dog had sensed. Vibration, strong and rhythmic, and coming from somewhere deep beneath the house. Not another avalanche. Something else. Something that his grandmother had known about and had chosen not to write in detail in her notebook. Something behind the iron door. Shadow looked at Nathan with eyes that held a question he could not speak. Nathan looked back at his dog, at the family sleeping near the fire, at the strangers who had become his responsibility, at the house that had saved them all from the fury of the mountain. Whatever secrets lay behind that iron door would have to wait a little longer. But Nathan knew now that the waiting was almost over. The mountain had spoken, and soon it would be time to learn what it had been trying to say. The vibration in the stone did not stop. For 3 hours after Shadow's warning, Nathan felt it pulsing through the floor like a heartbeat that belonged to something far larger than any living creature. He moved through the house, checking walls and windows and beams, searching for cracks or signs of stress that might indicate the structure was failing, but everything held the way his grandmother had designed it to hold. The others slept fitfully through what remained of the night exhaustion, finally overwhelming the fear that had kept them alert for so long. Rachel dozed with her children, pressed against her sides, one hand resting on Marcus's shoulder and the other tangled in Emma's hair. Walter Crane sat propped against the stone wall with his eyes closed, though Nathan suspected the old man was not truly sleeping, but simply conserving energy the way experienced survivors learn to do. Ben Sawyer had stretched out near the fire with his heavy coat as a pillow, and Kyle Webb had curled into himself in a corner, looking younger and more frightened in sleep than he had while awake. Nathan did not sleep. He sat at the table with his grandmother's notebook open before him, reading and rereading the passages about the iron door and what lay beyond it. Margaret had written about old mining tunnels that wound through the hill like veins through a body, about a passage that remained accessible when others had collapsed or flooded, about secrets that protected themselves. But she had not written about the vibration that Shadow kept sensing, the rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from somewhere far below the house. Shadow lay near the rear wall with his head on his paws and his eyes open, watching the stone with an intensity that never wavered. The dog had not moved from that position since his warning hours earlier, and Nathan understood that his companion was standing guard against something that human senses could not perceive. Around 9 in the morning, the storm finally began to ease. Nathan noticed the change first as an absence of sound. The howling wind that had filled every moment since the blizzard began slowly fading until he could hear individual gusts rather than a constant roar. The gray light through the snow-packed windows grew slightly brighter, and for the first time in what felt like days, there was a sense that the world outside still existed. Rachel woke first among the others, her eyes opening with the sudden alertness of a mother who had learned to sleep lightly. She looked immediately to her children, found them safe, then turned her attention to Nathan. "The storm is passing," she said quietly. Nathan nodded. "The front should clear within a few hours, but we're still buried. It will take time to dig out." Rachel rose carefully, extracting herself from between her sleeping children without waking them, and moved to where Nathan sat. She looked at the notebook still open on the table and at the lines of exhaustion carved into his face. "You haven't slept at all, have you?" "No. Nathan, you need rest. Whatever comes next, you won't be any good to anyone if you collapse." He knew she was right, but every time he closed his eyes, he felt the vibration in the stone and heard Shadow's warning growl and wondered what his grandmother had hidden behind that iron door. Sleep seemed impossible when the mountain itself seemed to be trying to tell him something. "There's something I need to show you," he said, instead of arguing. "Something I found my first night here." He led Rachel to the hidden panel in the wall and pressed the release. The passage to the iron door appeared cold air flowing out from the deeper cave, and Rachel's eyes widened as she took in what had been concealed. "My grandmother wrote about this," Nathan explained. "Old mining tunnels that run through the hill. She sealed this one off with that iron door at the end, but she never explained exactly what was behind it." Rachel stared into the darkness of the passage. "And you haven't gone in." "My dog won't let me. Every time I try to approach that door, Shadow blocks my path. My grandmother wrote that I should trust him, that he would tell me when the time was right." Rachel absorbed this information in silence, her eyes moving between the passage and the dog who still lay near the stone wall watching them. And now something is different. The vibrations in the stone started during the avalanche and haven't stopped since. Shadow has been on alert for hours, but he hasn't tried to stop me from opening the panel. I think whatever my grandmother was protecting, whatever secret she kept behind that door, it's related to why this house survived when everything else on this hill would have been destroyed. Walter Crane's voice came from behind them, startling Nathan, who had not heard the old man wake. "Margaret told me about those tunnels once, said they were the reason she chose this spot to build." Nathan turned to find Walter standing a few feet away, his weathered face serious in the dim morning light. "What did she tell you?" "Not much. Just that the old miners had found something in this hill that made it different from the others. Something about the stone itself, the way it held heat, the way it moved with pressure instead of against it. She said the tunnels were proof that someone before her had understood what this mountain was capable of." Nathan thought about his grandmother's notes on thermal mass and structural engineering about the fireplace that drew heat from living rock and the walls reinforced at points where stress would be greatest. She had not invented these principles, but had learned them from observation and study, and perhaps from whatever the old miners had discovered decades before her. "We need to open that door," Nathan said. "Whatever is behind it might explain what we've been feeling in the stone." Shadow rose from his position near the wall and moved toward Nathan, stopping directly in front of the passage entrance. The dog's amber eyes met Nathan's, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then Shadow stepped aside. The dog did not block the passage or growl a warning or give any of the signals that had stopped Nathan from proceeding before. He simply moved to one side and sat down, his eyes still fixed on Nathan's face, waiting. Permission granted. Nathan grabbed a flashlight and ducked into the narrow passage, feeling the temperature drop immediately as he left the warmth of the house behind. The stone walls pressed close on either side, rough and damp against his shoulders, and the floor sloped slightly downward as he moved deeper into the mountain. The iron door appeared in his flashlight beam after 30 feet of careful progress. It was old and heavy, the metal darkened by age and moisture, with a handle that looked like it had been forged by hand rather than manufactured. No lock was visible, just a simple latch that Margaret had apparently trusted to keep whatever lay beyond contained. Nathan reached for the handle and felt the vibration more strongly here, pulsing through the iron as if the metal itself was conducting energy from somewhere below. He pulled the latch and felt the door resist for a moment before swinging open with a groan that echoed through the passage like a voice from another century. Beyond the door, the flashlight beam revealed something that made Nathan stop breathing. A cavern. Not a tunnel or a passage, but an actual underground chamber large enough to hold the house above it twice over. The ceiling rose in a natural dome perhaps 40 feet above the floor, and the walls were lined with formations that sparkled in the light like frozen waterfalls of crystal and stone. But that was not what made Nathan freeze in place. In the center of the cavern, a pool of water steamed gently in the cold air. The surface rippled with the same rhythm Nathan had been feeling through the stone's small waves, radiating outward from a point near the center where something seemed to be bubbling up from below. A hot spring. A geothermal source that had been heating this hill for millennia, warming the stone that Margaret had built her house against, providing the thermal mass that made survival possible in the harshest winters. Nathan understood now why his grandmother had chosen this spot, why she had spent 40 years studying and building and preparing. She had not just found good terrain or lucky positioning. She had found something far more valuable. She had found the mountain's heart. He descended into the cavern, carefully testing each step before committing his weight. The air grew warmer as he approached the pool, and he could see now that the water was crystal clear despite the steam rising from its surface. The bottom was visible perhaps 20 feet down, lined with smooth stones that had been polished by countless years of gentle current. The vibration he had been feeling made sense now. The hot spring was fed by geothermal activity deep beneath the earth, and the pressure of water rising through rock created a pulse that traveled through the entire hill. His grandmother must have discovered this chamber and realized that the energy it contained could be harnessed for survival. The warmth that radiated through the stone wall of her house came from here. The thermal mass that kept the building habitable in winter was not just stored sunlight, but the living heat of the earth itself. Nathan stood at the edge of the pool and felt something shift inside him that he had not expected. He had come to this hill carrying grief and guilt and the weight of decisions that had cost lives he could not save. He had found his grandmother's house and her notebook, and had begun to understand that survival was possible even after the worst losses. But this cavern represented something more than survival. It represented the discovery that had made survival possible, the understanding that had transformed his grandmother from a grieving widow into a builder and a teacher and a saver of lives. She had not just endured, she had learned. And in learning, she had found something worth living for. Nathan heard footsteps in the passage behind him and turned to find Rachel approaching with Shadow at her side. The dog had apparently decided that the cavern was safe enough to enter, though he stayed close to the passage and watched the pool with alert interest. Rachel stopped beside Nathan and stared at the hot spring with an expression of wonder that softened the practical lines of her face. "It's beautiful." "It's why this house exists," Nathan said. "My grandmother found this and understood what it meant. The heat from this pool warms the stone above. It creates the thermal mass that keeps the house livable. She built her home on top of a natural heating system that never runs out of fuel." Rachel knelt at the edge of the pool and dipped her fingers into the water. "It's warm, like a bath. Probably around 100 degrees. Hot springs like this maintain consistent temperatures year-round because they're fed by geothermal energy from deep underground. Rachel looked up at him with eyes that held a new understanding. This is what she was protecting. This is the secret behind the iron door. Nathan nodded. I think she worried that if too many people knew about this, someone would try to exploit it. Drill wells build resorts turn something precious into something commercial. So she kept it secret and used it quietly to help people survive. Like us. Like us. They stood together in the warmth of the cavern while the steam rose from the pool and the mountain's heart beat steadily beneath their feet. Nathan felt the weight he had been carrying begin to shift, not disappearing, but redistributing, settling into a new configuration that felt more sustainable than the crushing burden he had known for years. His grandmother had found meaning in this place. She had taken tragedy and transformed it into purpose. She had built something that would outlast her and help people she would never meet. Nathan could do the same. He understood that now with a clarity that surprised him. The climb back through the passage was easier than the descent, and they emerged into the house to find the others awake and waiting. Walter Crane stood near the stone wall with one hand pressed against its warm surface and a knowing expression on his face. You found it, the old man said. The hot spring. You knew about it. Suspected. Margaret never told me directly, but I've lived on this hill long enough to notice things. The way her house stayed warm when everything else froze. The steam that rose from certain spots in the rock during the coldest days. I put the pieces together years ago, but I never said anything because I understood why she kept it secret. Nathan looked around the crowded room at the people who had been strangers 2 days ago and were now bound together by shared survival. Rachel and her children. Walter with his decades of mountain wisdom. Ben Sawyer with his hunter's knowledge of the land. Kyle Webb with his telecommunications expertise that might help them contact the outside world. And Shadow, always Shadow, watching over all of them with the patient dedication that had defined his life since the day Nathan had given him a purpose. My grandmother built this house to save people, Nathan said. She spent 40 years preparing for storms like the one we just survived. She discovered the hot spring and used it to create a shelter that could withstand anything the mountain threw at it. He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say, and knowing that it would change everything. I'm going to continue her work. I'm going to stay here and maintain this house, and make sure it's ready for the next storm and the next group of people who need shelter. This is what she wanted. This is the legacy she left me. Rachel met his eyes and nodded slowly. Walter smiled with the satisfaction of someone seeing a plan come together that had been decades in the making. Ben and Kyle exchanged glances that suggested they understood the significance of what was being offered. Emma, the little girl who had not spoken since asking if the dog had saved them, looked up from her rabbit and said something that made Nathan's heart clench in his chest. Can we come back and visit? Nathan knelt down to bring himself to her eye level. Anytime you want. This house is for everyone who needs it. The smile that crossed Emma's face was the first genuine expression of joy Nathan had seen since finding them in the buried car, and it was worth more than anything else that had happened since his arrival on this hill. The rest of that day was devoted to the work of survival that had become familiar during their time trapped by the storm. Food was prepared and rationed. The fire was maintained. Stories were shared and bonds were strengthened. Around mid-afternoon, Nathan heard something that made him stop what he was doing and move to the window. Engines. Far away, but getting closer. He wiped condensation from the glass and saw movement on the hillside below. Vehicles with flashing lights were making their way up the slope, following a path that rescue crews had apparently carved through the avalanche debris. The outside world was coming to find them. Shadow began to bark, not in warning, but in greeting the sound of a dog who recognized that help had arrived and danger had passed. Within an hour, the front of the house was being excavated by a crew of rescue workers who had been searching for survivors since the storm passed. Sheriff Daniel Marsh was among them, his face showing relief when he saw Nathan emerge from the shelter that had kept 7 people alive through a disaster that had claimed others on the surrounding slopes. "We found your truck buried half a mile from here," Marsh said. "Figured you were either dead or holed up somewhere waiting for help." "My grandmother's house," Nathan said. "She built it to survive exactly this kind of situation." Marsh looked at the structure with new appreciation, taking in the stone wall fused with the mountain and the design that had clearly been intended to withstand forces greater than normal construction could handle. "Margaret Garrett. I remember her. She used to come into town once a month for supplies, always talking about weather patterns and structural engineering. Most people thought she was eccentric." "She was a genius," Nathan said quietly. "And she saved our lives." The evacuation took most of the afternoon. Rachel and her children were transported to the hospital in town for evaluation, though they showed no signs of serious harm from their ordeal. Walter Crane accepted a ride to his own property on the lower slopes and promised to return when the roads were clear. Ben Sawyer and Kyle Webb gave statements to the sheriff and then went their separate ways back to lives that would now include the memory of a night spent in a house built by a woman who had understood what survival really meant. Nathan stayed. When the last rescue vehicle had departed and the sun was beginning to set behind clouds that no longer threatened snow, he stood on the porch of his grandmother's house and looked out at a landscape transformed by winter's fury. The avalanche had carved new channels in the hillside. Trees that had stood for decades were buried or broken. The road that had connected this place to civilization would need to be rebuilt before normal traffic could resume. But the house stood. The stone wall radiated warmth. The hot spring pulsed steadily beneath the earth-heating rock that would keep this shelter livable through whatever storms were yet to come. Shadow sat beside Nathan, leaning against his leg in the gesture of companionship that had sustained them both through 9 years of partnership. The dog's muzzle was grayer than it had been when they first met, and his movements were slower than they had once been, but his eyes still held the alert intelligence that had saved lives in Afghanistan and on this frozen hillside. "We're staying," Nathan said aloud. Shadow's tail wagged once in acknowledgement. Nathan thought about the work that lay ahead. The house would need repairs from the avalanche damage. The escape passage through the rock would need to be marked and maintained. The hot spring cavern would need to be documented so that future caretakers would understand what made this place special. But more than physical tasks, there was emotional work to be done as well. The weight Nathan had been carrying since Afghanistan would not disappear simply because he had found purpose on this hill. The faces of soldiers he could not save would still visit him in dreams. The decisions that had haunted him for years would still demand attention in quiet moments. Yet something had changed. The crushing burden had become something different. Something that felt more like responsibility than punishment. His grandmother had shown him that grief could be transformed into action, that loss could become the foundation for meaning rather than the end of it. Nathan would honor that lesson. He would build and maintain and prepare the way Margaret had done for 40 years. He would keep this house ready for the next storm and the next group of travelers who needed shelter. He would become part of the mountain's story, another chapter in a narrative that stretched back to the miners who first discovered the hot spring and forward to whoever would come after him. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in a sky that had finally cleared of clouds. The temperature began to fall toward numbers that would kill an unprepared person in hours, but inside the house, at the mouth of the cave, warmth held steady. Nathan went inside and started a fire in the fireplace his grandmother had designed to draw heat from living stone. He prepared a simple meal from the supplies that remained and shared it with Shadow, who accepted each portion with the dignified appreciation that had made him a perfect partner for a man who struggled with human connection. After dinner, Nathan sat at the table with his grandmother's notebook and began to write. He started a new section at the back of the book, adding his own observations to the record Margaret had kept for 4 decades. He wrote about the avalanche and the survivors who had found shelter here. He wrote about the hot spring cavern and what it meant for the house's ability to withstand extreme cold. He wrote about Shadow and the dog's uncanny ability to sense danger before human perception could detect it. And he wrote about himself. I came to this hill carrying weight that I thought would crush me. I found a house built by a woman who had carried similar weight and transformed it into something that could save lives. She did not escape her grief or forget her losses. She used them. She built something that mattered. I am going to do the same. My name is Nathan Garrett. I am 46 years old. I served my country in Afghanistan and came home with wounds that do not show on the outside. I inherited this house from my grandmother Margaret, who spent 40 years preparing it for moments exactly like the one we just survived. I am staying. I am going to maintain this house and keep it ready for whoever needs it next. I am going to learn everything my grandmother knew about this mountain and add my own knowledge to the record she kept. This is my purpose now. This is what I was saved for. And when the storm comes, I will stand. Nathan closed the notebook and set it aside. Shadow had moved to his customary position near the stone wall body, angled toward the heat that radiated from the rock eyes half closed in rest, but ears still rotating to catch sounds from outside. For the first time since he could remember, Nathan felt something like peace settling into the spaces where anxiety and guilt had lived for so long. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning that made the pain bearable. He thought about Rachel and her children, about the smile on Emma's face when she asked if they could visit again. He thought about Walter Crane's knowing eyes and the decades of wisdom the old man carried. He thought about his grandmother, whom he had barely known, but now felt closer to than anyone else who shared his blood. He thought about the soldiers he had lost and the decisions that had saved some and condemned others. Those memories would never fade completely, but they could be honored rather than just endured. Every person he helped survive on this hill would be a tribute to the ones who had not survived in the desert on the other side of the world. Nathan rose from the table and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness that had swallowed the valley below. Somewhere down there, lights would be burning in the town where people were going about their lives without knowing or caring about the house on the hill that had weathered a storm they might never hear about. That was fine. His grandmother had not built this place for recognition or gratitude. She had built it because building was what saved her, and because the act of creation carried meaning that mere survival could not provide. Nathan understood that now. He understood why she had stayed on this hill for 40 years after losing everything that had made it a home. He understood why she had written in her notebook that building had saved her when nothing else could. He was ready to begin. 6 months later, spring had come to the mountain. The snow had retreated to the highest elevations, leaving behind green slopes and rushing streams that sang with the voice of melting ice. The road up the hill had been rebuilt and improved, marked now with signs that identified the house at the top as an official emergency shelter maintained by the county with support from state emergency management funds. Nathan stood on the porch and watched a pickup truck make its way up the improved road dust rising behind it in the warm afternoon air. Shadow sat beside him, muzzle white with age, now movements slower than they had been 6 months ago, but eyes still alert and intelligent. The truck parked in the cleared area where Nathan's own vehicle had once been buried by snow, and Sheriff Daniel Marsh stepped out with a folder of papers in his hand. "Got the final approvals," Marsh said as he approached. "The house is officially designated as a regional emergency shelter. County will provide supplies and funding for maintenance. State wants to send an engineer to study the thermal system your grandmother designed." Nathan nodded. She would have liked that. People learning from what she built. Marsh looked at the house with an expression that mixed respect and something that might have been wonder. "I've lived in this county my whole life, and I never knew this place existed until you showed up. Margaret Garrett kept her secrets well. She had her reasons. I understand that now." Marsh handed over the folder of papers. "There's also a letter in there from the governor's office. Some kind of commendation for what you did during the blizzard. Saving those folks, keeping everyone alive until rescue could reach you." Nathan accepted the folder without opening it. Commendations and recognition had never meant much to him, even during his years in the Army when such things were supposed to matter. What mattered was the work itself, the doing of things that needed to be done, regardless of whether anyone noticed or thanked you. What mattered was building. After Marsh departed, Nathan walked the perimeter of the property that had become his responsibility. The house had been repaired and reinforced in the months since the avalanche with improvements that honored his grandmother's design principles while incorporating modern materials and techniques. The escape passage through the rock had been widened and marked with reflective paint that would be visible even in the darkest conditions. The hot spring cavern had been documented and photographed, its secret now known to the authorities, who would need to understand why this location was special. Shadow accompanied him on this walk, the dog's steps careful but determined despite the arthritis that had begun to slow him down. Nathan did not push the pace, allowing his companion to set the rhythm of their patrol the way Shadow had always set the rhythm of their partnership. When they reached the overlook above the valley, Nathan paused to take in the view that stretched for miles in every direction. The town was visible far below its buildings, small from this height, but representing the lives and stories of thousands of people who would never know about the shelter that waited on the hill above them. But some would know. Some would need it. And when they came, when the storms came, and the roads disappeared, and survival became the only thing that mattered, the house would be waiting. "We did it, boy," Nathan said quietly. "We found something worth doing." Shadow leaned against his leg and looked up at him with amber eyes that seemed to understand everything that human words could not express. They stood together as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, two veterans of different wars, finding peace in a purpose that had been waiting for them both since the day a woman named Margaret Garrett had buried her husband and brother and decided to build something that would last. The mountain held its silence, but Nathan no longer found that silence threatening. It was the quiet of patient waiting of stone that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. The house at its mouth was a small thing in the scale of geological time, but it was a human thing, full of meaning and purpose, and the stubborn determination to stand when everything said, "You should fall." Nathan turned and headed back toward the house, Shadow at his side, ready to face whatever came next. The next storm was out there somewhere, gathering strength, preparing to test everything he had built and learned and become. When it arrived, he would be ready. Rachel Thornton came to visit on a Saturday afternoon in late May. Her children ran ahead of her up the path to the house, Emma clutching the same rabbit she had held during the blizzard, Marcus moving with the confidence of a boy who had survived something that made everything else seem manageable. They found Shadow waiting on the porch and immediately dropped to their knees to greet him, their young hands gentle with the old dog who accepted their attention with patient dignity. Rachel walked more slowly, her eyes taking in the changes that had been made since her last visit. New railings on the porch, fresh paint on the trim, a sign above the door that read, "Emergency Shelter," in letters large enough to be seen from the road. "It looks good," she said when she reached Nathan. "Getting there. Still a lot of work to do before winter." Rachel nodded and looked out at the valley spread below them. "I wanted to thank you again. For what you did. For finding us. For keeping us alive. Shadow found you. I just followed him. You both saved us. And you're still saving people with this house, with what you're building here." Nathan did not know how to respond to gratitude that he had not sought and was not sure he deserved. He changed the subject instead. "How are the kids doing?" "Better every day. Marcus still has nightmares sometimes, but they're getting less frequent." Emma started talking more after we got home. She told her teacher about the dog that saved her life and the man who lived in the mountain. Nathan smiled at that description. "I don't live in the mountain. I live against it." Same thing to a 6-year-old. They watched the children play with Shadow for a while, the old dog finding reserves of energy that his daily routine rarely revealed. Emma had found a stick and was throwing it short distances that Shadow could retrieve without too much strain, while Marcus had discovered the hiking path that led to the overlook and was exploring its first few yards. "Will you stay?" Rachel asked finally. "Forever, I mean. Will you spend the rest of your life on this hill?" Nathan considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know about forever. But for now, yes. This is where I need to be. This is what I need to be doing." Rachel turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes holding an understanding that surprised him. She would be proud of you, your grandmother, knowing that her work continues, that someone is keeping the house ready for whoever needs it next. "I hope so. I know so." Rachel reached out and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of connection that Nathan might have flinched from 6 months ago, but now accepted without resistance. "What you're doing matters, Nathan. It mattered to us, and it will matter to others you'll never even meet. That's enough. That's more than most people ever get to say about their lives." She called the children then, and they came reluctantly, Emma pausing to give Shadow one final hug before following her mother down the path toward the car that waited below. Nathan watched them go until the vehicle disappeared around the first curve of the improved road. Shadow came to stand beside him, panting slightly from the unaccustomed exercise, but with a light in his amber eyes that Nathan recognized as satisfaction. "Good job, boy," Nathan said. "You made them smile." Shadow's tail wagged once, and together they returned to the house that had become their home. That night, Nathan sat at the table and opened his grandmother's notebook to the section he had been writing since his arrival. He read through what he had recorded over the past 6 months, the observations and improvements and lessons learned that would guide whoever came after him. Then he turned to a fresh page and began to write. Today, Rachel Thornton and her children came to visit. 6 months ago, they were strangers trapped in a car during a blizzard, and now they are friends who understand something about this place that most people never will. That is the legacy my grandmother left me. Not just a house or a notebook or knowledge about thermal mass and structural engineering. She left me the understanding that connection is possible even for those of us who have forgotten how to seek it. I spent years running from people because I was afraid of losing them. I had lost too many already in the desert and in the life I tried to build afterward, and the weight of those losses seemed too heavy to risk adding more. But my grandmother showed me another way. She lost her husband and brother in a single night, and she responded by building a shelter that has saved strangers for 40 years. She turned grief into purpose and isolation into service. I am learning to do the same. Shadow is sleeping by the fire, now his breathing slow and steady his body, finally showing the years he has been carrying since Afghanistan. He will not be with me forever. Nothing is forever. But the love I have for him is not diminished by knowing this. It is strengthened. That is the lesson Margaret taught me without ever saying a word. That we love not despite the certainty of loss, but because of it. That we build not because what we build will last forever, but because the building itself gives meaning to the time we have. Tomorrow I will wake up and continue the work. I will check the supplies and inspect the structure and prepare for a winter that is still months away. I will walk the property with Shadow and look for anything that needs attention. I will answer letters from people who heard about this place and want to know more about the woman who built it. And when the next storm comes, I will be ready. This is my life now. This is what I was saved for. I am grateful. Nathan closed the notebook and set it aside. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed orange in the darkness, but the stone wall behind the hearth still radiated warmth that would last until morning and beyond. Shadow had risen from his spot near the fire and moved to stand beside Nathan's chair. The dog rested his head on Nathan's knee, the gesture of comfort and connection that had anchored them both through 9 years of partnership. Nathan rested his hand on Shadow's head and felt the old familiar peace that came from the simple presence of another living creature who understood without needing to be told. "Good boy," he said quietly. "We're going to be okay." Shadow's tail wagged once, and outside the window the first stars appeared in a sky that promised fair weather for days to come. But fair weather or foul summer or winter storm or calm the house would be ready. And so would the man who had learned to stand.